Hey, welcome to Page Break. I'm your host, Brian McClellan, coming to you as the leaves begin to turn here in the mountains of Utah. A quick FYI, my next appearance will be at Brandon Sanderson's Dragonsteel Con in Salt Lake City on November 14th and 15th. I'll have books and swag to sell, appear on a handful of panels, and of course will sign books you bring to me. I also want to apologize for the sound quality on this one. We struggled to get Matt's mic to recognize my recording software, so his side is a bit dodgy. Hopefully it won't ruin the experience. Now, on with the show. My guest this week is video game narrative designer Mateusz Tomaszkiewicz. Matt is best known for his 12 years with CD Projekt Red, where he worked as a quest designer and principal narrative designer on The Witcher 2, The Witcher 3, and Cyberpunk 2077. He has recently moved over to Riot Games, where he is the principal narrative designer for their upcoming MMO. Matt and I chat about his time with CDPR and the challenges of leaving his friends and coworkers to move halfway around the world to work for Riot. We also discuss the complexity of designing quests and narratives for video games, coordinating with other departments and hitting deadlines, and accounting for millions of players while also telling a story. Enjoy my conversation with Mateusz Tomaszkiewicz. So you grew up and lived most of your adult life in Poland. What was it like switching over to the US last year?
It's very interesting. I mean, I've been to US a number of times before, mostly on like gaming shows, so mostly the coasts. I never really explored more like inland US. There are some like big differences, like big cultural differences I noticed. Like Polish people are not really known for small talk, and Americans seem to love it, which was a big change for both me and my husband. Like we're not used to everyone wanting to talk all the time, you know, when you meet people. So that was one interesting thing. In general, we really like it here. It's really nice. The weather is obviously amazing. It's South California, so you know it's great. Compared to Poland in winter, for example, oh my God. What else can I say? Other than that, well, there's everything we need here. You know, we have the mountains, we have the ocean side. It's great. We love it.
It is very pretty. But I do love Poland. I've gotten to go a couple of times.
Oh, you did?
It's my it's the foreign language for me as an author that sells the best.
Yeah. The language is pretty difficult, I would say. I have a few American friends who live there, and they are trying to learn, but it's tough.
Whenever I go, I try to learn a couple of words, and I can't get them down at all. I'm so bad with language.
Yeah. I think it's especially for like if you're a native speaker in English, I think this is especially difficult because there are specific sounds in Polish that sound all the same for English speakers. Like there are a few different letters that are like sh, chi, and like ch, and they are different like sounds, but for my American friends, they all sound the same, right? And sometimes it can change the whole meaning of the word.
When you were working at CD Projekt Red, were you working in both English and Polish?
Yes. So originally, when I joined CDPR back in 2008, it was mostly a Polish team. Not that many people who spoke other languages. So the whole team was working naturally in Polish. But then after we released Witcher 2, we started hiring more and more international people. And then we had to switch like the day-to-day language because, people felt excluded when you spoke in Polish in front of them. Something was like, there were like tensions and some things were just not working. So we had to switch and start communicating in English most of the time. However, when we were on a meeting with like only Polish people, because these happen sometimes, obviously it was easier to just, use your native language and just go ahead with that. And I know, because we hired from all over. So we had like a group of Germans who sometimes would speak German in the kitchen, or like people who spoke Spanish, and so on and so forth. It was really interesting.
Did you find that kind of transition to working in English to be difficult?
At first, yeah, like most people in Poland learn English at school, and I was no different. Of course, I did learn it, and I actually was. I think I was pretty good at it. But like written English and like school English versus actual conversations in English day to day, and having to explain like difficult design concepts in English, it was kind of challenging at first. But I think it was great actually, because it allowed, I think, all of us to level up our language skills, and in general, like it did make the company feel much more inclusive, and and generally open to differences, because let's face it, English is the international language. Like everybody speaks it. So,
Well, and I was told when I was in Wrocław, I was told that that pretty much everyone under 30 speaks English pretty well.
Yeah.
Is that the case?
It is, but like I said, I mean, I thought I knew English pretty well, and the first time I went to Australia, to Sydney for like a business trip, and I had to go to the store and order things and name foods, I was petrified. And it might be because I'm an introvert, but also like I just didn't have to do this kind of stuff in English before, and it was scary. So I think a lot of people in Poland do have like a knowledge of English, and like they can speak it to a degree. But I think people that don't work in companies that have to cooperate with people from other countries, that they have like high proficiency in it, if you know what I mean. And yeah, of course, like people who are a bit older from like the previous generations, they mostly were learning Russian, because obviously Poland was in the Eastern Bloc and Russian was the language to learn, right? So like my mom, she doesn't speak English; she only speaks Russian and Polish, because it was so normal back then in the communist era.
Now, tell me a little bit about what it means to be a quest designer for gaming.
Mm-hmm.
Because I understand narrative, I understand writing. I write epic fantasy novels for a living.
Of course, yeah.
But like I'm really fascinated by the way a video game, it's very different, because you have to tell stories, but you also have to be working with the developers and working with the design of how like all the mechanics work and levels work, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
How do you go about that?
Yeah, so it of course depends on the project, because there's extremely there's a lot of variety in video games. Like you'll get video games that will have a very little narrative. You'll have video games that are almost purely narrative with some slight gameplay elements. But working on RPGs, which was my primary experience as a quest designer, it was basically about it's like being a jack of all trades to a degree, because you have to have a good narrative feeling, like what works and what doesn't, like in order to tell good stories, right? But then you also need to understand the technical side of things, because you actually need to build it in game engine. It needs to work. It needs to cover for all the things that players might think of doing. So it's like this combination of narrative and technical skills. And at the same time, it's also like, at least in CDPR, that was the case, where you not only have to care about the narrative and like, is it working, but also like about requesting assets from all other departments, like what kind of character models will work for this, or what kind of music would fit the best this sequence, so it actually conveys the emotion you want to convey, right? So my brother actually compared it to being a movie director, because it also combines all these different things, just on a smaller scale. Because if you're a quest designer, you're most likely responsible for a few pieces of the narrative. You're not responsible for the entire thing, unless of course it's a smaller project where like you're the only quest designer. Then yes, but most of the time the way we did it was we had like the write-up of the full thing, and each quest designer would get a piece of that or few pieces of that, and they would be responsible for these pieces. And then a lead of that team, which was for Witcher 2, it was my brother. For Witcher 3 and Cyberpunk, I was in that role. And basically that role is about seeing the bigger picture. Like all the team members have all these pieces, and you need to make sure with the writers that it actually makes sense as a whole plot arc, right? Because you can do the best quality possible pieces, right? But if it doesn't come together, it doesn't come together. It's just a mess. So yeah, sorry for a long-winded answer, but
I love that. That's fascinating. I'm really interested in the way that stuff like a video game and writing for a video game, it really becomes more about it comes about the balance of being a project manager versus also being a writer and a creative person.
Absolutely.
Did you ever struggle with that kind of thing?
Of course. I mean, there are certain things you want to do creatively, and they would be better for the project. But at the same time, you have to face the realities of production. But I guess you get the same in the movies, right? Like you sometimes see, like, we don't have enough budget for this CG. Maybe we should do it like I read recently this article about She-Hulk, and apparently the writers had a few talks with the production about like, could you write in less scenes with She-Hulk being She-Hulk because the CG is so expensive, right? It's also the case in the video games, and the thing with video games is it's this, but multiplied by all the different departments we have. We had to care about the character models, the environments. We had to care about the time needed to record all the dialogues, and and all of this like comes together, and then you have to face that reality. And of course, we know we could make this content better. Like you could spend infinite amount of time on the game content and add like variations to what the players are doing. Maybe the characters react to everything you do. But like in case of a game with full VO, like The Witcher, every line counts, right? Because it amounted to a huge amount, like number of lines, and each of them you have to record. And in our case, I think it was way over 10 languages. I think maybe like 12, 13. I don't remember exactly. But, it causes basically each line of dialogue costs more. So it also kind of forces you to be more concise. We had these passes with the writers of, making the dialogue more concise. So we could cut down from the lines where maybe they are not as needed, and maybe we can keep them in places where if you do cut there, like it would really impact the quality, and and the emotional impact of these scenes would be not as big as we need it to be, right? So yes, absolutely, it is a lot of that, and it is a bit of a struggle. But it is also kind of interesting at times because it forces you to create more efficient solutions and, like think creatively about how you solve problems. And yeah, I think it's not going to go away. I mean, there are some ideas on the market on how to make certain aspects of video game making cheaper, but they are also very controversial. Like, there are these AI generators for sound, for voices, for example, right? And some of them imitate actors pretty well. And it is scary, actually, because, it could put people out of jobs. And, working with actors is also a great part of this job. Like I was present on the multiple recordings, and it was always a joy to hear them speak out the lines and, see them get into the character. So, yeah, I don't know if I want to reduce the costs this way, but...
Right. Well, and that's kind of the balance that you're going to have to face going forward with any video game, especially nowadays, because there's now like this kind of huge resurgent indie market going on with, Steam and all of that stuff.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then, you've got the AAA games that are you've got that war between the monetization of, all of the, like, trying to get the pennies out of everybody, right?
Yeah.
Versus, do you just create a one big game and put it out there?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, for someone like me, for a creator, it is much preferable to not think about monetization. I mean, I would love nothing more just to think about, like, I want to create something really good and put it out there and sell it once, and that's it, right?
Yeah.
Ideally, this is what would work best for me. But of course, like, again, like you said, the reality of it is, like, it is a business, right? Like, video games, need to make money as well. So it is an important consideration. And one thing I think is important about it is, like, when you do think about monetization, is to think about it as, to make it at least, like, basically think about the players, like, what will be a good solution for them and what will not be annoying to them, and make it as fair as possible. I think this is the way I thought about it in the past when I was involved in any of these conversations. Like in CDPR, like, one of the big goals for us was, like, to be fair to the players, and when we release content, to make it significant and to make it justify the price, basically. And it was always, like, a policy for us. So yeah, this is definitely, like, one of the values I hold deep, close to my heart. And yeah, I mean, I personally, as a player, not as a developer, but as a player, I also prefer models where I can buy something, own it, and, like, pay for, like, a significant chunk of content, and enjoy it, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, and that, that ties nicely into Riot, because, I got into League of Legends when it was first in the beta, long time ago. And I remember really appreciating when they started monetizing it, how the monetization was all optional. If I wanted to spend a couple of dollars on a skin for a character I loved, I could, but I didn't have to.
Yeah.
And it didn't change the gameplay.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate it when it's cosmetic and not gameplay.
I agree. Absolutely. I absolutely agree with this. I did play a bit of League, and I also noticed that about it. And to be honest, for the most part, I didn't really spend money in it. And the game was still enjoyable, and I didn't really have to. So yeah, I totally agree with you. And from my observations so far, it seems like Riot is also keeping players first, basically, and they're trying to make the best they can about making it fair. So I really like it about the company as well. I'm not long in Riot yet, but so far I really like it.
Yeah, you only arrived in January, right? So about 8 or 9 months ago?
Yeah, that is correct.
Yeah. So how is that transition for you? Do you, because you spent most of your career at one company for over 12 years, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like, CDPR was the first company I started working for, and I stayed there for, like you said, over 12 years.
Yeah.
It is a huge change, but honestly, this was one of the big reasons why I changed jobs, because I felt like if I won't try it now, like, I will get my roots so deep that I will never try it. I also really wanted to try living abroad. It is a big change, like, it's like you're maybe not abandoning, because I still talk to people from CDPR. I have a lot of friends there, but you're kind of like, leaving behind the network you had built, like a safety net, and an environment where you knew how to function. It was very natural. You felt that, like, it's like your second home, right? And you go into, like, a completely new organization, new team, and you have to build all of that from the scratch, right? So it is a scary experience, but I think it's also a very valuable experience, and I think I would recommend it to everyone are wondering if they should make, like, big changes at some point in their life.
Yeah. Oh, and I'm glad that you're able to kind of look at it with that kind of with that optimism, because it's scary, like because I've changed publishers not that long ago,
Mm,
and that's not even nearly as big of a deal, because I talk to my publisher a few times a year, and
yeah.
it's and changing publishers is scary because you've got a whole new business model behind your books and all that.
Hmm.
But man, changing an entire company, because when you come to like gaming companies, it's not just like the company that you work for 9 to 5. You also play games with those people, and
Of course.
like there's
See them after work. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right, there's like a creative and friendly intimacy that isn't there in kind of a normal 9 to 5 job.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. And yeah, that was, I think, the most difficult part of this whole transition. I still play video games with them. Like I said, like we played Warhammer with my quest designer friends from CDPR all over the weekend, Warhammer Total War. And yeah, that was the most difficult part, honestly. But I think it was important for me to do this because I felt like, I never knew how does it look like in other companies, and like is our company good compared to other companies? Like, are there things we could improve, like based on what they do? I think it just helped me grow a lot already. I mean, even though I'm not long in Riot, I already see a lot of things that Riot does differently, and a lot of really cool solutions that I feel work very well, basically. And yeah, it's just a huge growing experience, honestly. And this is exactly what I wanted. I mean, it's easy for me to say because I was kind of doing it out of a safe position where I am like financially stable. I have a stable life. So doing this change was coming from a place of security. So for a lot of people who have less stable situation, it might not be as easy. But yeah, like this social part of it, like and like this combined, like probably if it was another company in Warsaw, it would be much easier because I would have easier access to all the people I know. So this combined with moving overseas, especially so far, because it's like an 11-hour flight, 9-hour difference with my friends from Poland. That was a huge shift.
Yeah. And I bet that's got to be a little bit frustrating, because when you want to game with them, it's a totally different time of day.
Yes.
Like,
yeah,
not even close.
Yeah. We can only do weekends, really, because during the weekdays, when they leave work, I'm starting work because it's like 9 or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not really doable during the weekdays. But on the weekends, it's actually not that bad. Like it's their evening, so actually they're done with most of their day-to-day stuff. So we can sit. I can, I just make myself coffee and we can start playing for a few hours. It's not that bad, but definitely was easier when I was still in the same time zone.
Yeah. Oh, I imagine. Hey, Page Break listeners. Brian here, rudely interrupting myself for a bit of a plug. Making a podcast isn't free, and I'm hoping that you enjoy it enough to pitch in a pittance. To do so, head on over to patreon.com/pagebreak, where you can toss as little as $3 a month into the tip jar, $5 a month to get the podcast ad-free and early, and $10 a month to hear your name in the credits and feel a smug sense of superiority. You can also buy my books from your favorite retailer or direct from my website. Thanks to everyone who contributes. Now back to me. So, when you came to Riot, what is it like, not just coming into a new company, but coming into to a pre-existing world? Because you're working on the MMO, and I understand you can't talk a ton about that. But I'm very curious about kind of how that is more to you as a creator, coming into somebody else's world that is very deep, and they've got the new anime that's won a ton of awards. They've got years and years of backstory for characters and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Do you like coming into a pre-existing world, or is it a little bit jarring?
I do like it, honestly. I mean, when you think about it, It's not the same as the experience I had previously, but when I started working in CDPR, there was already as well like a lot of pre-existing elements of the world because it was based on fantasy novels, right, by Andrzej Sapkowski. So it was already existing world, and we were building on top of that foundation, right? And it kind of feels in a similar way in Riot because, like you said, there is so much stuff that was produced before I joined. So definitely, like it is a bit of work to catch up on all of these things. Especially, I did love Arcane when I watched it, and when I got into the setting, I see a lot of really cool things in it that we can build on. So yeah, in this regard, it's actually not that different from what I was doing before. One difference is, of course, like when I joined CDPR, I was already a big fan of Sapkowski's works. I've read all the books, I knew all about it, right? So here it's a bit different because I had to digest all that source material. I did have some experience with work on things from scratch on settings. Actually, today, a project I worked on before I came to Riot, I had this like period of doing different things between CDPR and Riot. Today, that project hit Kickstarter. It's a story-based board game, kind of like Descent. And me and my friend, who also used to work in CDPR, we built a setting. We did a lot of world building for that. So that was actually much different experience because it was working on a setting from the scratch, and I would say that was way different than compared to CDPR than what I have now compared to CDPR.
Different how?
Well, when you work on a setting from the scratch, you have to think about things like the basic rules of the world, like its cosmology, like geopolitics of it, what actually makes it different from other settings, like what are the, selling points of it, etc., etc. When you work with a pre-existing setting, a lot of these things are probably already established. So, it's a matter of learning them and not really designing them from the scratch. So I would say in many ways, like designing a setting from the scratch, it is liberating because you can do whatever you want, right? But at the same time, it is more difficult because you have all these considerations that you have to think of, right? Yeah, like in case of Kinfire, that's the name of the project. It was the goal was to build like a fantasy setting that has like strikingly different visuals and like elements that differentiate it, and it had to work for a specific rule set for the board game. So there were certain things that needed to happen, like you needed to come back to the town often, for example, right? So we had to think, for example, what makes this specific town special, right? Like why you're coming back to this specific town. So we started building on it from there on. Yeah, like with pre-existing settings, I think it's more of the case of like, what do we want our game to be? And how do we make it work within that setting and not actually conflict with what is already there, right? How do you make the elements of that setting work for you and not against you, kind of thing? So it is more limiting in this regard because there are like layers of already existing things. Like, for example, for The Witcher, if we wanted to do an RPG where you can do like literally whatever you want, like you can be evil, that actually really doesn't work well with the main character of Geralt because he was a already established character who would never do these things. So back then we had to think, how do we present choices to the players in a way that they still feel agency, so they have control over the character, but at the same time, we don't break Geralt's character. We stay true to Geralt's character, right? And it was an interesting exercise, I must say. I think in a lot of ways, it allowed us to create more sophisticated choices and stories because we were kind of forced not to rely on like lazy design choices, so to speak. Like we couldn't just say, "Oh, you can rescue the orphans or like burn the orphanage or whatever," because Geralt would not do this stuff. So we would have to think, okay, how do we add nuance to this orphanage quest in a way that you have choices that are impactful and you still have like some kind of dilemma, right? So yeah, that was very actually interesting and stimulating in a way.
That is really cool. I've kind of talking to other creative professionals, I've noticed that it does seem like when you get writers and people that do this kind of thing for a living, that when you give them a little bit of a framework, whether it's a pre-existing world or whatever you're trying to work on, the framework often kind of helps keep a writer focused.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Because, and I speak from experience as somebody who does design worlds from scratch. It's so easy to get distracted. It's so easy to go in any direction whatsoever.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. We had the same thing with Kinfire, honestly, at the beginning. Like, you have so many options on the table, like you don't even know where to put your hands in, right? And it's almost like, I would say it's just being overwhelmed with the amount of choice, which is funny, because the same thing happens when you give players too many choices in the game. Like, sometimes they will just have like a decision paralysis, right?
Yeah.
It's much easier to work sometimes within certain boundaries. And if you have too many options, it's just, you don't even know where to start. I think what helped us in this specific case was to build a process for ourselves where we would say, okay, no, we'll pitch the ideas first. We'll brainstorm with the team. Let's see which ones resonate the best. And we'll just go onto adding more layers of detail and coming back, doing this feedback loop, right? So it wouldn't be the case where we say, okay, give us half a year, we'll come back with the ready setting, right? No, we prefer to work the way we worked in the previous company we worked at. So with like a very specific process with steps and checkpoints and all that. So adding structure to this workflow actually helped us a lot to actually get it done.
Do you find yourself working kind of normal business hours, or are you one of those people that spends a lot of time at night and on weekends and things like that in your creative worlds?
Depends. Like, okay, so depends on when I worked on video games. It was usually normal hours during the week. However, sometimes when I was designing things, so like doing paper design, not actually implementing an engine, I would sometimes just sit down and do it on the weekend because I had a creative spark, right? And sometimes it could be a week of just staring at a Word document and not being able to write a sentence, or like writing the beginning and just deleting it because it sucks, right? For the setting building for Kinfire, it was actually much closer to that second approach. So we would write when we felt inspiration to write. Normal work, like normal business hours, didn't really work well. It's difficult to force yourself sometimes to come up with ideas.
Yeah.
And also, like, my friend, he already moved to Canada at that point, so we had this big time difference, so it wouldn't be even possible. So we set up meetings for ourselves, like checkpoint meetings, like, okay, what did you produce, what did I produce, etc., etc. But we didn't like set like very hard hours on working on these things. It's also the case, like, when I have something very, very specific to make, it's actually fine to do it during like a very structured week, because it's like a rhythm, like you like now I work on home office, so I get up, I make myself a coffee, I log in, I download the newest like version of like editor and everything. I have a checklist of things I want to do this day. I do them, and then I sign off, and it's like very clean and organized. But with writing stuff, it is often the case that I have a creative block, and I can go on for a week without doing anything on it, and then I have like 2 hours where I'm like, bam, 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 it's done, right?
Yeah, that's definitely how it is with at least with my novel writing. I mean, every novelist is a little different, but for me, it's definitely very much a like I kind of have to be in the groove for it to work.
Yeah.
And I can do my business things in the morning. I can answer emails and all the random stuff.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the actual writing, sometimes it's going to take a couple of drinks and, 12 at night.
Yeah.
before anything happens.
Inspiration strikes in weirdest places. Yes. Yeah. I mean, like I noticed, like, sometimes it's like subconsciously procrastinate. Like, I do anything I can to find other things to do and not touch this thing, because I'm like, no, it's not now. It's just I prefer to clean the whole house than sometimes touch this stuff. But then, yeah, I don't know what it is. It's sometimes it can be like something I noticed and it just like clicks and I get in the zone, and then yeah, my husband will yell at me like you should log off, and because it's like, I don't know, 10 p.m. and I'm like, no, I'm in the zone. Just don't talk to me right now. I need to finish this thing. You know?
My wife will come down around that time, around 9:30, 10 o'clock in the evening, and she'll come down and she'll be like, are you ready to watch a show? But like if she walks into my office and my keyboard is clacking,
Yeah.
I'll just hear a really loud sigh from the hallway, like,
She knows what's going on. She's been there before. Yeah.
Yep. She knows that I'm in something. And then I'll either say, okay, come back in a few minutes.
Yeah.
Or I'll say, okay, I'm just about done, you know?
Yeah, like I don't know how it feels to you, but to me it feels like this rush of energy, and like my head is buzzing, and now I finally know what I need to do. It's like this moment of like absolute clarity,
Yeah.
you know? And I love it. I love it when it happens. I hate the struggle when you're like struggling to type in anything, you know?
Yeah.
I did, like when I was like under like tight schedules sometimes, I did this thing, a bit different process where I forced myself to write something that sucks first. I was like, look, I know this sucks. This is probably the shittiest quest I wrote. It doesn't matter. I just need to build something that logically works so I can actually build on top of this. And a lot of times that actually worked out quite well, like into quite nice quests we built in the past. So the first draft, I knew was not good, but it was functional and it sold the idea I wanted to sell. And then I would just iterate on it. And actually that sometimes sparked this creative spark as well. Because I would look at the existing text and I would be like, oh, actually, this scene could be built in a different way, or maybe combined with this, we could remove that. And now it actually works pretty nicely. Actually, this is kind of cool, you know? Or, I mean, because video games are like very, working on video games is very like collaborative process, you don't need to always depend on just yourself to squeeze this thing out of yourself. You can show this like ugly draft to someone. Like I had a few really good writers back in CDPR that I worked with, but you know, some of them are still my friends now. And I love just saying, look, I know this isn't great, but this is more or less what we need to build. Could you take a look and could we discuss? You know, and they looked, and sometimes it inspires them, like, oh, this scene could actually be about this and that, and then you know, like we add some deeper layers to it, and then it's actually pretty cool. Honestly, like some of the best quests we made for The Witcher 3 were built that way, like with just vast amount of iterations and layers of feedback. And sometimes it can be like a very exhausting process because it feels like you're trying to squeeze out water out of a stone, right? Like there's not much there, but you're squeezing, right, until that actually pours out of it. But yeah, honestly, sometimes this is the only way to go. Like we would get these quests on The Witcher where we would redesign them a few times and we played in the game and we were like, you know, yeah, this really doesn't work. Like it's still, yeah, the thematic is off, you know, like we don't really know how to build it, or like any ideas we had where they were like not reasonable, they're not doable really. With some of them we really struggled where I remember like late meetings, like emergency meeting, we need to redesign this now because later we will not be able to use assets for it, and it's not a good quest. And I guess we could ship with it, but you know, nobody would be happy with this if we shipped with this. So they were like meetings where we put a number of people in the room and everyone worked really hard trying to like brainstorm like a way out of this, you know. And sometimes it was like everyone was super tired, and anyone would be like, we want a semi-working idea, and we all just want to go home. Like anything, give us anything that just, you know, would allow us to like move a step forward. But then the other day, you know, like sometimes slept on it, and this is how we call it, like we need to go home and sleep on it, right? Because sometimes like just getting out of that room, getting fresh air and like going to sleep and, you know, like coming back with fresh head would already unlock some ideas for people. And I think we managed to fix all the quests that were like that, you know. And sometimes it's just craftsmanship, right? Sometimes it will not be. We know it will not be a revolutionary thing, but it does its job. It does it well. It's enjoyable, you know, and it's good enough to keep in the game. And it's not actually. Because again, it's a combination of a lot of things, right? if you have a certain amount of things on specific quality level, if some others are like, especially like some side quests or like some side activities, if they're a little bit lower quality, sometimes it's okay. Not everything has to be the Bloody Baron storyline.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I think that's kind of how it is with books as well. There are times when, like, because every chapter, every quest is going to be a little different. It's going to resonate with different people differently. And there are times, especially I imagine with something like a video game, where you're trying to create a very rich depth of content. And every single piece of that content can't all be perfect.
Exactly, it's impossible.
You've got to ship. You've got to get the product out there. Hit deadline.
I mean, maybe if you spend like countless years for it, maybe that would be possible. But yes, it is. We were talking about like production constraints before. They are there, and they are not going away. And the longer you wait, the worse it gets. The closer you are to release, the less things you can actually do. Like even like you're close to release of the game, and producing this specific piece of content, like a model or like animation or whatever, and putting it in would make it so much better. But you simply cannot allow it, because putting that thing in could destabilize the whole build, and now you're spending more time on debugging it, and you're releasing a game with more problems, right? So at some point there is like a cutoff point where it has different names in different companies. Like some people call it hardening, because you no longer like open the stitches and like replace things. You just want to polish the thing. You want to remove as many bugs as you can and have the best quality of the product you can when you release the game, right? Yeah, you're simply not able to just move that further. And yeah, that's the reality of it. I mean, I remember on one GDC I went to, when me and my writer friend, we had a presentation on choice and consequence, and someone from the audience asked us, because we were talking about production limitations, but very vaguely, right? And someone asked us, well, why can't you account for every possible choice players might make in the game? And to me, we tried to explain it, but it's really difficult to explain to someone who didn't work in that framework, because, yeah, like if you never worked in a video game company, it might be difficult to explain all these like production limitations, why adding each next choice will actually generate more costs, and it might push your deadlines, and it will generate more bugs, and more voiceovers, like all of that stuff combined. I do believe, like, if you were like treating it like just as an like ideological experiment and spent like your lifetime on it, you could maybe build it, but you have to also live, right, of something. And unfortunately, we're not, like, we cannot always do what we want. I cannot just spend my whole life building one game and like build like a perfect game. The only thing I can do is try to get as close to it as I can within the boundaries that I'm given, and that's
something that I find myself becoming much more sympathetic for as I get older is with these especially big things, because I've built a career off of kind of knowing how my little corner of creativity works.
Mm-hmm.
And it's mostly about me, just me.
Yeah.
My publisher has some stuff. There's cover art and there's an audiobook reader, but it's mostly me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's already complicated enough.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I become much more sympathetic towards when you have a gaming studio, when you have a movie studio,
mm-hmm.
and you're trying to create something that requires the creative input of maybe 5 people or 10 people or 500 people.
Yep.
It becomes so much more expensive, and it becomes so much harder to craft.
Absolutely.
And I don't think normal consumers really understand how a truly good video game, how special that actually is.
I agree. I think in general, but it is a little bit of our fault, because as developers, we don't really talk about this stuff openly a lot. It's not really, circulating the discourse that much. I mean, if someone really wants to learn these things, of course they can like buy a GDC pass and like log in and watch all the presentations. but there is a lot of arcane knowledge in the industry that we're not really talking about a lot. So it's no surprise that a lot of people don't know this stuff, right? I bet most people don't even understand like your process, like who's the editor, right? Like what are they doing? Because they would just assume, well, you sit down and then you write the book, and then if publisher likes it, they publish it, right? Simple. They don't see all the steps that lead to it. So yeah, I mean, it is absolutely true, I think. And I heard similar sentiments from other writers that were joining our team before that didn't work with video games as a media before. So either people who published books or were mostly coming from that area, right? But even people that worked on like scripts for like TV shows and so on, it is still vastly different experience for them. Because, you know, like aside for having a bit more complexity than movies, video games also have things like in the narrative specifically, like accounting for player actions and choice, right? So yeah, especially in games like RPGs, like it is a very different way to write things, because instead of like a linear script, right, which you could put like on few pages, you get like a graph. It's more like a graph, really, when you think about it, right? It's like this web that you're building. Like, did they go this route or this route? Some people compare it to these choose your own adventure books that used to be popular back in the day.
Yes, I was just thinking about that. Yeah.
Yeah, like it's a common comparison. And I think it's quite accurate. Like you have to think about the ways the players go, and you know, at the same time, you don't want to build dead ends, probably. You don't want to build dead ends in your story where players will never reach the conclusion of the story. Like, what did the characters learn? Like, what was their journey and so on? Well, you will never learn because you made bad choices. Restart. That's usually not the way you structure video games. Usually, the way you structure big games like those is like you have a core of the game, which most people will probably go through, unless their character dies and they restart. But that's a different matter, right? But your story choices usually don't lead you into a dead end where the rest of the story is cut off. It's of course it's doable. It's just not something that most games do. So yeah, in reality, you get this core, and the player character goes on a journey, and they reach some conclusions, right? So more classic approach to storytelling, but accounting for choices along the way, and probably different endings. It really depends on the game, right?
Well, and that's something that fascinates me about those kind of the kind of choice-based RPGs is that you have to account for branching narratives.
Yeah.
You know, when I'm writing a book, I'm writing a single story all the way through. You know, there's maybe multiple points of view and different perspectives and things, but it's a single narrative. Mm-hmm. But when you're writing something that lets the reader, the player, choose,
yeah,
it creates so much more complexity. Even just a handful of choices create great complexity, and I don't think, again, this is one of those things that I don't think that the actual end user actually understands.
Probably not
how complex it is, kind of under the hood.
Oh, absolutely. Like one of the big parts of my job as a quest director and earlier quest lead was doing exactly this. So keeping track of all of these like branches that are, you know, going in different directions, and make sure that they don't break the game, or make sure they're all accounted for, right? So I would play continuously through all the quests that all the designers were building, and all the dialogues that all the writers were writing. Of course, the lead writer would also go through these, but he would be more focused on like the quality of the writing. Does the story tell the things they want to say, and so on? And I was looking more at I was looking at these things as well, but I was focused on the logic of it. And like, I would bring feedback to them, like, look, in this dialogue, actually, this situation will not work like this if the player played like that. So we need to either create like a second version of that dialogue where the character already met certain people, for example, or someone died, right? Or we change the scene in these ways, so we actually account for it, but in like a cheaper way, right? So I did a lot of this, and it is kind of, you know this meme, this very popular meme with this guy who stands in front of like this board with strings connecting different pictures and all that, right? And he's trying to explain it. That's how it feels a lot of times, because there are so many dependencies and things. It's like a lot of moving things that, like influence one another.
It's crazy to try to get people to understand just how much, like, for instance, like one of the big complaints about Fallout 4 was that they had kind of reduced the dialogue to, like 2 or 3 choices.
Yeah.
And the thing is as a game player, yeah, that sucks. I loved, New Vegas. I loved 3. It was so great. But then, as someone who kind of understands how these stories are told and designed and built on some level, it's clearly they were trying to reduce the workload to make it a little bit smaller.
For sure.
So that they didn't have to go absolutely wild.
Yeah, like one of the things, it's funny because one of the things that working in game development does is obviously it inadvertently changes the way you experience video games as a player. I cannot look the same way at video games anymore. Like when I play the game and I see certain problems, I'm like, oh, I know exactly why they have this problem, and I feel for them because we had this and we struggled to fix this. At the same time, like I think you can still look at a game and say, I kind of get why they did it like this. And actually, this is the part which is like kind of like a struggle, because on one hand you're like, yeah, I see why they did it like this, but at the same time, but maybe they should have sacrificed something else. Actually, in this case, because it actually did get the quality much lower, right? So I think you can still be critical, even as you're understanding, but for sure it helps you not give in to like very cheap shortcuts where you just say, oh, they must have been lazy or they just didn't care about the game, right? Because this is like very hurtful and like it's just not truthful. Like, I don't know. I've met a number of game developers throughout the years, not only in the companies I worked for, but like on like different gaming shows, like on like some like game dev parties and stuff like this. I never met a video game designer that wanted to create crappy things or didn't care about their work. Usually they're very passionate people and they want to do the best quality they can, but very often they're just either facing this production reality we're talking about and they do not see way out of it, and maybe there is a way out of it, they just cannot see it because they are in it for so long. They don't see a way out of it, so they just go with it. They're like, well, this is what we have to do, there is no way out, right? We've been in these situations before. So often, actually, it's very helpful to get like an outside perspective, someone who tells you, actually, look, I understand all the problems, the realities of production, but maybe do this and that, and this will help. And actually, honestly, like sometimes you're just blind to these things because you've been stuck in that specific place for so long, right? And on the other hand, I think sometimes it's also the case of just a lot of different factors that impact this specific outcome, right? Sometimes sometimes projects go through like turbulences, like maybe they change teams sometime a few times. You probably read these articles about like what happened in BioWare around Andromeda and what was it? Oh, I'm forgetting the title of it. Anthem, right? It sounded like there were a lot of things going on in the production and throughout the development of these games that impacted the final outcomes, right? And often, yeah, I don't believe that people on these teams didn't care. I believe they cared very deeply about the projects they made, but sometimes it's just not up to you.
Yeah,
and and that's actually like coming back to one of your earlier questions. This is one of the big things regarding making video games. They're very complex organisms, very, very complex, and sometimes, like you said, are made by hundreds of people, right? Or even more. And then, yeah, like if you have like a complex systemic failure, this is what happens, right?
Well, and it can't even, like, when you get into like a company that's that big, it grows to beyond to like the problems that can happen will grow beyond just writing or, creating the world or whatever,
Yep.
it will grow to, there might be corporate problems way over your head.
Yes.
Or maybe two project managers hate each other's guts and it has nothing to do with the game whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I often said to the leads I was working with back in CDPR that when they ask me what's the biggest challenge in working on video games, I always say communication. Just because these teams are so big, and the bigger they get, the more complex, difficult it gets. It's impossible to have teams with no conflicts whatsoever, And yeah, like you said, sometimes when it festers, it can be really impactful and problematic, And often, like in these huge teams, you'll have not even sometimes it's not even conflict between two people. Like these are very extreme situations. It doesn't happen that often, actually. But more often, you'll get a lot of small miscommunications. Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. And as these accumulate through production, these miscommunications or lack of communication in certain areas, the problems will pile on to the point where the problems are really big and difficult to face and fix. This is why it's extremely important to continue working in communication at all times, in big organizations. It's actually interesting because when you work on a book, for example, there is still a level of complexity, as you said, but you have the comfort of being the person that is responsible for most things happening in it. I assume, and yeah, like in video games, it's not that way at all. It was funny actually because there was this ongoing anecdote where we had 3 teams that were all working on narrative to some degree. So quest designers, writers, and cinematic designers. And whenever we spoke to people from all these teams felt like the other teams are the ones that have more to say, and they would like to have more to say. Like quest designers would sometimes say that about writers would say that about quest designers or cinematic designers, and cinematic designers would say the same, obviously. So it's interesting because all 3 groups felt like the other groups actually are the ones that are forcing things in, right? While in reality, it's this back and forth. I say and a lot of very good quality things we made was coming from that place. So we would have some of these things would be a result of back and forth. It was not like a singular vision of one person. It would be rather worked out between multiple people, and this was the end result. And I think this is more often than not the case in this process.
Oh, that's super fascinating. I love hearing about the way that creative professionals work on projects that are so big and unwieldy. It's really interesting, and it's because it's kind of what I do for a living, but in a much more in a much more complex way.
Yeah.
Because like you said, there's so many more moving parts. It's such a big living organism to try to complete, right?
Yeah, and there are a lot of factors that impact communication, like very simple things sometimes, like language. I think I told you before in this in our conversation, we all spoke English, like that was the communication language in the company, but because I'm not a native in English, I sometimes might have misunderstood someone who was, or you would have non-natives speaking in English from many different cultures and countries, and their level of English was also different, and maybe some idioms were not obvious to them. They were not picking up on some subtleties, right? And that already can cause a big miscommunication. I'm actually reading recently a book about I don't remember the exact title right now, but it's a book about communication between cultures and in organization, and managing teams when you have teammates from other cultures. It's fascinating read, really, because there are certain traits that dominate certain nationalities, their cultures really, and they impact in a heavily the way they communicate. So, for example, there was this example of for example, in Chinese culture, it's very popular. It's very of course, you will get people who will be an exception, right? But on average, they usually are communicating less directly. So they will say less because there is a meaning that is assumed everyone will understand in between the lines, right? While Americans, for example, this is what the book says, are more direct with the way they communicate. Like they will explain more in detail. Like good communication in US is about, according to the book, going in as many details as you can to explain it fully, right? So in China, for example, this is not the way they communicate at all when they talk about things. So when you put people from these two different cultures in one team and they have to work together, you will get miscommunications, because this is what it is most of the time, which can create conflicts because the one person might imagine the other person doesn't want to tell them something. And it's not the case at all. This person thought they said everything they need to say, right? Because this is the way they communicated all their life. And now suddenly something else is expected of them, but nobody says it explicitly, right? So yeah, this is very interesting. And the thing they recommend, which I wholeheartedly agree with, this is what worked best for me in the past, is to actually apply the model of over communicating, because it is the easiest one to apply to like a multicultural team. Whereas if you try to go with the approach of like these subtleties, actually this will not work, because even cultures that are kind of similar in way of communicating. So let's say, I think they were saying the Chinese and I think maybe Spanish people. I'm not sure on that, but there are cultures that use this way of communicating. They have a different set of like meanings in their functioning in their culture, and this is what allows them actually to communicate with less words, right? When you have a group which is more multicultural, you don't have these common meanings because they're coming from different cultures, which is why also the book explains US is like this, because it had to evolve to be this, because it has it had so many people from different cultures in it.
I was talking to a friend of mine recently who works in the energy sector, and he was talking about how part of his company is owned by a kind of a Japanese corporation. And he said that sometimes it's really difficult to really good at cross communication, because in the culture, you're not supposed to disagree with your boss.
Yeah, exactly.
No matter how wrong they are. And so something like that becomes a struggle for just trying to get something done, even if you both want the same result.
Absolutely. And and that's the thing, there is no real conflict there. Like there is no, maybe sometimes even disagreement on values or disagreement on what do you want to achieve, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's mostly these built up miscommunications and misunderstandings between people, because they do not understand where this other person is coming from, right? And it can cause a conflict, but basically these are solvable. It's not like I want A, you want B. It's just we cannot agree on what A is, right? Like because we cannot find common language, even if we speak the same language. That's the funniest part about it.
Yeah, very much. Well, so I have kept you for quite a long time, but I like to end every one of these episodes with a kind of a left field question,
Sure.
Which is, what's the last food that you ate that blew your mind?
That's a difficult one. Well, there is this really nice restaurant in LA. We like to go there from time to time. It's called Osteria Moza. It has one Michelin star, and I think, and I usually don't go to fancy restaurants like this, so I wasn't sure what to expect. But in general, they have really solid, very good Italian food.
Ooh.
And I think the one that blew my mind the most was the way they prepared the octopus.
Oh, yeah?
Because, it was like one of the appetizers, actually. But I don't know what they did to it, but it was like cooked really nicely. Like most of the octopuses I ate before, like they were like not like nice texture, like maybe chewy and so on. This one was like really nice texture, and like it was seasoned really, really nicely. And somehow they made, because there was like celery, I think, around it. Somehow, and I really don't like celery, but they made it actually in a way that actually was really enjoyable, which was really surprising to me, because I usually don't eat that, and I would actively avoid it. But in this case, I would eat all of it. I would clean the plate. So I guess that.
That's fantastic. I normally do not like seafood, but one of my weird little quirks is that I actually really quite like octopus.
Mm.
And if I see it on the menu, I'll get it.
Yeah, actually, it's apparently really bad because they're very intelligent and nice animals. But it was delicious, I'm sorry to say. So yeah.
Yeah, that could be tough when something is very good, but maybe not ethically.
Yeah, it is ethically it's questionable, I would say, at least.
Yeah. That was narrative designer Mateusz Tomaszkiewicz. Thanks again to Matt for coming on to chat. You can find links to Matt's social media down in the show notes. You can find me, as always, at brianmcclellan.com. Special thanks to James Sutter for music and Tom Bishop for production. If you'd like to support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com/pagebreak or buy my books in ebook, paperback, or audio. You can also get signed copies of my books direct from my website or swag from my Redbubble store. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review. If you're listening to this via Patreon, please stick around for bonus chat during the epilogue. Special thanks to Elijah, Ivor Gullickson, James Clark, Jennifer Johnson, Jay Sunnell, and Kyle Anderson for their backing on Patreon.